Welcome to CGHE seminar number 220, and it's great to see a lot of people coming into this very interesting webinar where our colleagues will present material in relation to a special issue of British Journal of Educational Studies on Diaspora and Internationalisation in higher education, and clearly the theme is occasioning a lot of interest around the world, as judging by who's coming into this webinar. Before I introduce our panelists, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Remember that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CGHE website in due course. We find that people are watching it in YouTube, and more people are seeing it now in YouTube than are seeing it live. A transcript of the chat function the conversation in the chat today will also be posted on the CGHE website. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar unless you've been asked to speak or you're asking a question. There's no need to have your video on either during the webinar, but please turn it on when you're asking a question. We recommend that you use the speaker view setting so you can more clearly see who is talking. Now, to ask a question, and we will have four brief presentations, which will take about half an hour, and then we'll have a Q&A period. To ask a question, put your question in the chat in writing first. At the end of the period of presentations, I'll then start inviting people who've signified their interest in the chat into the live webinar, and they can go on camera and ask the question then. If your question is selected, then please unmute yourself, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. I'll give you a warning in the chat so you'll know that you're about to be brought in to the Q&A. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce such a great group of colleagues. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. Professor Paul Morris will be opening up. Paul is a professor of comparative education at the Institute of Education at UCL, where he's worked since 2007. Previously, he worked at University of Hong Kong and was president of the Hong Kong Institute of Education, which is now the Education University of Hong Kong. Our second speaker will be, just a moment, Annette Bamberger. Annette is the Goldemeyer postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Hebrew University, and her research focuses on global education policy and practice and the ways in which they're framed and interpreted in diverse contexts. She's pursued a number of research projects in recent years, all of which have been in some respects linked to internationalisation themes in higher education. Our third speaker, and we've temporarily lost her, or has she come back on? Oh, good, she's there. We had a connection problem. Our third speaker is Terri Kim, who's well known to many, I'm sure. She's Professor of Comparative Higher Education at UCL IOE. She's an honorary full professor at UEL, University of East London as well. Sorry, I've got that wrong, Terri. I'm going to start that again. You're Professor of Comparative Higher Education on full professor at UEL, honorary senior research fellow at UCL IOE, and you're an academic visitor at St Antony's at Oxford. Your scholarly interests centre on relations of territory, mobility, knowledge, identity, and network, ethnic nationalism and internationalism, diasporas and higher education, transnational academic mobility, and identity capital as a comparative historical sociology. Our final speaker, a colleague I've known for many years, is Professor Fazal Rizvi, who's in Australia. He's an emeritus professor at the University of Melbourne. He's also emeritus at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in the United States. And he specializes in global sociology, and his work, again, as with the other three, will be known to many of you. At this point, it's a delight to ask Paul to start the webinar for us.
Simon, thank you very much. As Simon has said, this seminar relates to a special issue which is forthcoming in the British Journal of Educational Studies on the topic of Higher Education, Diaspora and Internationalisation. So, Annette, could you put the, I'll just upload 2 PowerPoints, please. Right, so moving on to the second one. Here are the articles that comprise the issue. There's 8 of them. I won't go through them in detail, but it's the first 3 articles that are the subject of the seminar today. 2 of the other authors are, I believe, in the audience, Christine Han and Oldak, who is the author of article number 7. And I'm sure if you have any questions, they'd be very happy to join in at question time. Annette's paper will be focusing much more on the field and where the articles relate to that field. Terri will focus on the second article, looking at those 3 topics in the context of Korea and Israel. And Fazal will be looking at international higher education and business diaspora with a focus on Australia. The 2 articles I've put an asterisk next to have already appeared on iFirst within the journal, and the others are shortly forthcoming. I think with that, I'll hand over to Annette, who will take us into the first paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. I want to go ahead and, as Paul mentioned, I want to give a little bit more of a background to our special issue and the collaborative work that we've been doing over the past several years. This special issue stems from a grant that we received from the BAICE, the British Association of International and Comparative Education. And I want to sort of begin by exploring some recent developments in diaspora theorization in the humanities and social sciences more broadly. And I want to connect this with internationalization in higher education. And I want to present then some insights from a systematic review that I recently performed. And then I want to conclude by just bringing out a couple of the issues which I think have real potential for theorizing different forms of internationalization. So with that, I want to start with this first idea of diaspora and its changing perspectives over time. So essentially, there used to be an idea of diaspora, which was very much connected with exile and a tragic expulsion from a homeland. Groups were often viewed as very marginalized in host countries and very much worthy of suspicion by national governments. And this is sort of the traditional idea of diaspora, which held for a very long time. And in the last few decades, there's really been a shift in that to more of a study of the idea of dispersion and connectivity. And that this dispersion and connectivity creates and confers social advantage. So in today's sort of globally connected world, having networks around the world, being able to speak multiple languages, having multiple different ways to move and be around the world are actually viewed as a much more positive thing from the role of, from the side of states and national governments, and also obviously corporations and businesses. So this has shifted in many ways in line with a broader shift in the humanities and social sciences, a shift towards more sort of postmodern and constructionist thinking and studies of what we would call roots, R-O-U-T-S, as opposed to what was before, which would be considered more of the roots, R-O-O-T-S. And these sort of changing interpretations over time, we also see that they align with emerging approaches to diaspora. So a first approach, which has been which Mavrudi defines as bounded, a bounded type of meaning, as opposed to an unbounded, is connected very much to the traditional idea of tragic expulsion, homeland, and a marginalized group, and really study of ethnic groups, and homeland, hostland, and boundary maintenance. And this type of scholarship usually has an approach which is considered often essentialist, in that it assumes, it takes for granted the existence of diasporas, assigning them particular characteristics, and often viewing them as natural, primordial, and perpetual. So this approach is associated with more the traditional notion of diaspora, and often revolves around defining, categorizing, and mapping diaspora formations. This type of scholarship obviously is open to critique, often for its homogenizing discourses, for ideas of the diaspora and not recognizing differences within those large categories, and sort of a static view of social reality. The second approach, which has become more widespread, is the constructivist and postmodern approach, which essentially views diaspora as a social identity, which is always in the process of becoming, and that it can be created, dissolved, mobilized, hybridized, and that it moves over time and space. So that has really been developed significantly by Stuart Hall and Patrick Gilroy. And these sort of, while there are many different approaches to diaspora, these are sort of the main two that we have today. Within this idea, within these two approaches, there's many different ways to employ diaspora, so in research. So if you can think about diaspora as in terms of an actor, in international relations disciplines, it's also viewed as entrepreneurs. You can see diaspora as a policy discourse and a political practice. So again, that's very common in IR and political science research. You can also view diaspora as a form of social movement and study it in the same way that you might study other social movements. This has developed more recently in the fields of cultural geography and diaspora studies particularly. You also have, as I mentioned in the previous slide, a lot of emphasis on identity and subjectivities. So using diaspora as a way to examine a certain type of identity, be it ethnic, hybridized, religious, etc. And this is very often used by cultural studies and in feminist research. It's also can be used as a cultural, can be seen as a cultural practice. And quite a bit of globalization studies have actually taken this on, so how diaspora relates to cultural practice. And within those different ways that diaspora can be employed, there's a plethora of different issues which diaspora addresses. So homelands and host lands, while originally there was much more of a dichotomy between sort of a homeland and host land, now that has become pluralized, and there's much more of an emphasis on flows of people, ideas, cultures, and ideas of circulation and connectivity. There's also a continuing focus on boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. So who decides who is within a diaspora and who is not? And within that also particularly issues of agencies, agency again of individuals and groups. And you have ideas coming out about, again, hybridity of identities and communal practices, and third spaces which are created, also a more sort of critical issues coming out about issues of history and development over time of different diasporas and how they're changing over space and time and their different forms of connectivity. So these are just some of the issues to give an idea and a background again about some of the ways in which diaspora has both expanded in its theoretical toolbox and in its thinking over the past decades, and also some of the issues which it addresses. Now, I want to take that and think about how it connects to higher education and internationalization particularly. So over the past years, there's been an increasing amount of diaspora policy and initiatives, particularly at the state level, aimed at researchers and students, in which higher education is part of that. So we can think about sort of Korea's different brain gain policies and programs they've started, China's different programs to attract its researchers back home. Israel has a program like this. There are many governments who are doing programs like this and have policies which, again, deal with diaspora and higher education. There's also Alan Gamlin in 2020, his recent book on diaspora institutions from Oxford University Press really documents the explosion in diaspora institutions over the past decades. So the very rapid growth of institutions which are both state, but also run and funded and governed by diaspora communities and donors abroad. So you see a lot more interaction with the diaspora and in this area. And higher education has been one of the areas which has been considerably affected by these institutions. So you see that between these policies and initiatives and the different institutions, that these are awfully closely connected with internationalization practices, particularly. While they might not be recognized as similar in terms of their policies, in terms of actual practice on the ground, we see a lot of overlap in terms of how researchers, international researchers, and diaspora researchers are often put in the same types of frameworks. And are often dealt with in similar types of ways within universities. We also see that while internationalization focuses primarily on mobility, there's several recent critical systematic reviews which have come out in the past years, one in higher education, which was, I believe, Mwangi and colleagues, which essentially these reviews focus on the fact that internationalization is primarily researched in terms of its mobility. So when we look at diaspora, we focus on a wider set of issues. So while there is a focus on mobility and dispersion, if you will, there's also a significant focus on connectivities, identities, agency, relationships, and also control. So thinking about that and those connections and giving the increasing complexity of the term diaspora and its increasing theoretical approaches and growing relevance for higher education, I thought it would be worthwhile to understand a bit more about how it's being used in higher education research in a more systematic way. So I want to share briefly, again, I'll only share a couple points here. The full article is already published online if you would like to go into it in more detail. But I want to share sort of just a few main points from the systematic review that I did, which this review looked at the connections between diaspora and higher education, and then specifically how internationalization was positioned within that. So the final cohort of articles, there were 80 articles. Interestingly, only 19 of the articles were published in journals dedicated to higher education. And most of them, 62 of the 80, were published between 2010 and 2020. So we see that there's really been an uptick in interest in this area. Essentially, the analysis that I did and the coding that I did, they were focused around two main types of diaspora scholarship in higher education. One, which we see here in this first section, deals with diaspora as a type of human capital and a state possession. So in this way, diaspora is linked to a political state, and articles adopting this view define people by their dispersion and degree of belonging to the state. So while diaspora was often underdefined in these studies, they were framed around discourses of globalization, national development, and competition, and the growing importance of higher education in driving innovation and national development was paramount in these studies. And in the backdrop, this idea of increasing competition between states for the highly skilled, what's been dubbed the global war for talent. So many of these studies were based in a literature which was very similar to migration type studies, which dealt with sort of the brain drain, gain, and circulation literature. And it took for granted sort of the pull of global North countries and universities for their diaspora, their nationals, and were and states within this paradigm were aiming to reverse this trend and to entice their diaspora back home. So the majority of the articles in this cohort were essentially analysis of policies and programs which have been set up to essentially attract back what was usually dubbed knowledge diaspora. So they were particularly focused on researchers in this category and looking for ways to keep connections with them if they were still abroad, or to lure them back to their home countries. So within this, the type of scholarship was very evaluative, descriptive, and often very prescriptive. So looking for sort of best practices and recommendations for state authorities, for example. There was a considerable amount of, within these studies, there was very much an acceptance of the state defining the diaspora and a very homogenous idea of what, about who they're addressing. And there was also, very interestingly, if you look here on the side, if you look at the countries that were the samples from the cases, from the different articles, we can see that the majority of the articles came from Asia, particularly China, and from Africa. And what you see here is that there was a very strong discourse around volunteerism, and that essentially a wide assumption across articles that diaspora were loyal to the state, and that they were willing to help out the motherlands, and that if they were not doing that, that was part of their responsibility, and that if they were not, they were remiss. So there was really a feeling of responsibility towards of these diaspora toward the nation state, and that their role was then to be this bridge between home and host. And again, in these studies, if we just look at some of the countries, it was very obvious the sort of lack of criticality in terms of any discussion of the politics, if potentially people from Eritrea, for example, might not want to come back to that country due to the civil war and the military occupation, or if there might be other countries who, researchers might not want to be affiliated with them anymore. So all of those discourses were really lacking in this set of studies. The second set of studies deals with this marginalized other and construct, and I'm conscious of our time, so I'm going to go quite quickly here. Essentially, this was sort of, in many ways, the other side of the coin. So it dealt very much with identities of students, scholars. It dealt with wider, almost no policy, much more was about sort of looking at how diaspora forms and being part of a diaspora, how higher education has formed that type of identity, whether it be through heritage study abroad, or different international collaborations. And this literature was based much more on a critical perspective, using post-colonial studies, diaspora and migration studies, feminist frameworks, and dealing much more with identities and how higher education impacts on those. I want to just say, and again, you see sort of the type of scholarship here, that it was much more of an exploratory and explanatory type of a process with critique as well as advocacy, as opposed to sort of the more policy assessment type scholarship in this category. What you did see was that there was also very much the idea of agency taken to what I would consider somewhat of a maximum, in that at times there was not a lot of discussion of structural issues and structural inequalities within higher education, and more of the focus was on how marginalized students could use their diasporic networks and contacts to build their identities. So moving on from that very quick sort of overview, I just want to mention a couple areas which I think could be areas to build on from this, and some of them which our special issue does. So if we think about process approaches, I think the process approach has a lot of potential, and I think it's been very underutilized in the field. So how is higher education serving as an institutional site for creating diasporic identities? And what are the characteristics of these identities? What mechanisms are in place to produce these types of identities, whether it be the formal curriculum, the informal curriculum? Who shapes and controls this process? And I'm happy to say that Fazal, who will be speaking shortly, he did address some of these in his paper, particularly around the curriculum. So we'll get to hear a bit more about that. The other issue was critical policy analysis. So the vast majority of policy analysis was very much for assessment and evaluation, and was not really looking at how these policies are creating a certain type of diaspora and the inequalities therein. And third, historical work was really missing within this, because many of these communities have great histories, and which impact on what's happening today in their networks today. But the starting point for much of the research was globalization. So I think that's also something missing, and that's something that Terri will pick up on afterwards, and she'll talk more about that, which our special issue does address. And finally, methodologies. There was a lot of sort of interviews and policy analysis, but there was a lot of other things that were missing, like observations, for example, and particularly wider samples. So instead of, basically there were no studies where somebody who contested or had a more difficult relationship with the state, for example, was included in any of these studies. So sort of there was very one-sided voice, which resulted in this volunteerism sort of trope. On that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Terri Kim.
Thank you. Thank you, Annette. I think my slide will be shared by Trevor. Thank you very much. Thank you, Simon, for your kind invitation and introduction of four of us in this panel seminar. I will briefly talk about the paper that I wrote with Dr. Annette Bamberger. And next slide, please. Thank you. Our paper has four themes, as listed here. And the conventional approaches to higher education are often premised on premise that the nation state is the primary actor, especially in orchestrating higher education internationalization, and we challenged this assumption by separating nation and state and appropriated diasporic subjectivity and diasporic institutions from a comparative historical perspective. The common assumption that state and nation are the same entity is misguided and dangerous. And not every state is a nation state, and not every nation is a state, obviously. And we considered the two cases of stateless nations in the early 20th century, Koreans in the Japanese colonial period from 1910 to 1945, and the Jews during the period of British mandate for Palestine from 1920 to 1948. And the rationale for comparing the Korean and Jewish diasporas is a threefold. Both, first of all, both Koreans and Jews are considered to have had ethno-national diaspora, and both Koreans and Jews have experienced the condition of stateless nation. And thirdly, both founded their modern nation states after World War II in 1948. So we take the notion of ethno-national diaspora as a stateless, a fluid, dispersed ethnic nation whose members imagine themselves as a community, invoking Benedict Anderson. And regarding the well-known, the Jewish question, I bring in the notion of the Joseon question. The Joseon is the old name for Korea, which was raised by the Korean diasporic intellectuals in the early 20th century in the context of geopolitics. And like the Jewish question, the Joseon question dealt with the civil, legal, national, and political status of Koreans within their own country, but without sovereignty, as Korea became annexed to Japan and Koreans became subject of Imperial Japan with no equal right to ethnic Japanese, Nihonjin. The Korean national independence movement, both inside and outside the country, then was ignited by the motif of the right of nations to self-determination promulgated by Lenin in 1914 and Woodrow Wilson in 1919, as well known. So the two historical cases illustrate how higher education was linked to ethno-national diasporas in terms of ethnic nations rather than state and state actions, and how their ethno-national diasporas contributed to the higher education internationalization in the absence of a supportive state apparatus. And both the Korean and Jewish cases illustrate that ethnic nationalism was not only compatible, but often overlapped with ethnic internationalism in the process of building and internationalizing higher education. So the next slide, please. And our paper entails the narratives of diasporic individuals, such as Dr. Paul D. Che and Dr. Judah Magnus. My my slide disappeared. And then also our paper entails diasporic institutions such as the Korean National Association, KNA, founded in 1909, headquartered in San Francisco, and also well-known Zionist organization in the context of geopolitics. So both cases, diasporic individuals and institutions engage in the higher education internationalization as part of the imagined nation building long before the actual establishment of the nation states in 1948. So, so our focus on diasporic subjectivity and diasporic institutions complements the limits of the methodological nationalism and recovered as part of its history, thereby obscured. So back in the contemporary 21st century, These historical cases, case studies entail noteworthy implications for contemporary human geopolitics, within which it is important to understand mutations of diaspora and evolving diasporic subjectivity and connectivity in the internationalization in higher education. So thank you. I will stop here. And I think Fazal is next to speak.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim and Annette and Paul. My paper is based on an analysis of some 50+ interviews I've conducted with successful businessmen and women in Australia of Indian and Chinese background, as they reflect and as they were invited to reflect on the role their higher education in Australia played in contributing to their business success and their perceptions of Australia-Asia relations. I wanted to find out what role did higher education play in providing them with the skills and dispositions relevant to exploiting the commercial opportunities associated with the globalizing economy. How have, for example, their knowledge, their skills, their transnational ethnic networks been reshaped and reformed by their higher education in Australia? So much so that it helps them to cultivate commercial and cultural links, interlinks between Australia and their country of origin, something that is in fact a defining characteristic of the contemporary concept of diaspora that Annette talked about. In short, using Australia as a case, I examined the ways in which higher education may aptly be regarded as an important site of diaspora formation. So the notion of diaspora formation is fairly central to my analysis. Now, as has already been pointed out by Annette, while the traditional notion of diaspora was associated with such ideas as exile, suffering, loss, and victimization, its post-war meaning was often linked to the broader politics of migrant experience and the desire of immigrant groups to retain their cultural traditions in the host country. Now, under the contemporary conditions of globalization, this meaning, or the concept of diaspora and its meaning, has expanded greatly. And it no longer refers exclusively to ethnicity and migration, but increasingly to transnational networks of many different kinds. It highlights the diversity and dynamism of communities, their capacities to be embedded simultaneously between multiple locations, as well as their ability to forge transnational systems of ties, interactions, exchange, and mobility. In this sense, the meaning of diaspora involves performativity. As Stuart Hall many years ago pointed out, diaspora does not represent a naturalistic category, but suggests instead dynamic processes of cultural formation, what Hall called diasporization rather than diaspora. Now, for diaspora groups, mobility across national boundaries does not mean abandoning particular traditions and links, but acquiring new ones and forging new ones. There is an element of creativity that is involved in diaspora formation that is important for us to note. Their sense of belonging is not necessarily flamed through an ethnic nostalgia, but through engagement with an expanded sense of possibilities. There is no need for them to abandon national affiliation, but it is now possible for them to view their identity, their national identity or national identities through a more transnational prism. Transnational diaspora thus have links in all kinds of ways that can be beneficial to them and has become a source of commercial opportunities and political claims of various kinds, both nationally specific and global. The idea of diaspora thus involves a strategic construction based on particular interest, making it possible to speak, for example, of entrepreneurial and religious and political diaspora, and not only national or state diaspora. That refers to a point of reference, but not necessarily to a nation state. In this sense, this view of diaspora challenges both the statist and stasis assumptions of the traditional literature. Now, from this perspective, my interviews with Indian and Chinese Australian businessmen and women showed that they employed various strategies to build upon and extend existing ethnic networks, both within Australia and transnationally, in attempts to realize their many different objectives. In commercial context, their use of diaspora networks was often central to their entrepreneurialism. One of my interviews referred to their cultural knowledge, their intercultural skills, and transnational networks as their diaspora advantage. Others insisted that the continuing links to their country of origin or ethnic networks was essential for their businesses to succeed, particularly in the services sectors, such as education, for which they supplied services to both the ethnic communities and to the wider communities. Now, most of our interviews were effusive about the ways in which their higher education, mostly in business studies, indeed 90% of the people that we interviewed had done a business degree, contributed to the knowledge and skills that enabled them to develop their commercial ventures. In other words, they were perfectly ready to acknowledge the contribution that the higher education had made to their success. It is in the business courses where they consolidated their market-oriented knowledge and dispositions and sensibilities. For them, there was a little doubt that their curriculum not only provided them with a certain body of knowledge and skills, but more importantly, an ideological perspective on the world and opportunities associated with the globalizing economy. It instilled in students the importance of enterprise and entrepreneurialism. Now, the discourse of entrepreneurial skills and enterprising interview now deeply shape education at all levels. But in business courses, they have become core organizing concepts. They are regarded as key competencies relevant to all students in steering their personal development, active citizenship, and their employability. Courses in business studies claim to contribute to the development of the entrepreneurial spirit. Indeed, this goal is consistent with the World Economic Forum's advocacy for entrepreneurial education, predicated on the premise that innovation and entrepreneurialism provides a way forward for solving the global challenges of the 21st century, building and sustaining development, creating jobs, generating renewed growth, and advancing human welfare as well. Similar sentiments in business courses aspire to making a tangible contribution in developing knowledge, skills, and attitudes important for employability, active citizenship, and new business creation. Now, most of our interviewees who had come to Australia for higher education and had stayed on to become permanent residents or citizens embraced this particular human resources view of education, or human capital formation view of education. They believed that the business knowledge they had gained, the entrepreneurial skills they had developed, and the networks they had cultivated during their courses had placed them in a good position to derive personal benefit from the strengthening of Australia-Asia relations, especially in the commercial realm. Their opportunities depended on the expansion of Australia's global relations in trade, investment, and collaborations, especially in culturally modulated, knowledge-based industries and services, many of which required sound and reliable intercultural relationships. However, they also realized that this success was unachievable on their own, and that it required them to forge effective diaspora networks, both within Australia and transnationally. With more than 1/3 of all students in Australian universities coming from outside the country, higher education has inevitably become a transnational space, enabling social formations that span national borders. It has become a site of unprecedented levels of cultural diversity and exchange that have the potential to allow new hybridized social formations, if you like, new diasporas, through creative engagement of the courses on the one hand and their objectives and the interests of the students on the other. It has opened up the possibilities of decentered attachments, of being simultaneously home away from home, of ever-changing representations that provide an imaginary coherence, as Hall pointed out once. A diaspora can be held together or recreated through the mind, through cultural artifacts, and through shared imagination. International education is thus not a neutral space with respect to the values it promotes. It is a site where a great deal of work is done to forge a new transnational imaginary, through which means of cultural production, both formal and informal, that include value-laden approaches to curriculum and pedagogy. For example, the ideas of global competence and global citizenship education are promoted in the curriculum to develop particular kind of student subjectivities in business courses in particular, based on certain assumptions about the benefit and opportunities available in the globalizing economy. Now, as I have already pointed out, the curriculum in business schools is inevitably built on the tenets of supply-side economics, while education is viewed in terms of human capital formations. At the level of attitudes, students are thus expected to imbibe the virtues of innovation, enterprise, and entrepreneurship. Within the context of these ideological notions, which have now become ubiquitous in higher education, diaspora links and networks are viewed as advantageous to the students who can straddle cultural and national borders, especially when they're able to convert their knowledge and skills and networks into strategies of accumulation. So my final point really is that there is a synergy between the aims of business courses, bachelor's of business studies, master of business studies, and the kind of diasporic aspirations that students initially come with, but then build upon and extend a great deal. And that's actually what my paper tries to do through a whole range of examples and interview data. Thank you.
Thank you all. We've got a few minutes left for questions. I'm going to start by posing the question about the nature of our times. This interesting mobile exchange between movement and territoriality, which you've discussed, this ebb and flow, where are we going now? We seem to have more assertive states, more assertive national borders as a factor in identity, and we have blockages to physical travel in lots of places, which are affecting our capacity to be mobile and to think in those ways. Where's the world going like now in the next 5 years or so?
I think, Simon, it's very difficult to predict at this stage, okay? It is quite clear that there is blockage at the moment, but the imagination of the universities, university leaders, and students and their parents is still a world of immobilities that they experienced in 2018 and 2019, rather than the one that they have. So in other words, they are seeing increasingly this period as a temporary interruption to the kind of links that they had assumed between mobility and territoriality. Now, whether the actual conditions would permit that assumption to be sustained remains to be seen. And I think that's why it's so difficult to predict how long this stoppage, if you like, will last, and how long the global tensions, the geopolitical tensions, and the COVID conditions are going to persist remains to be seen. So as a result, my own view is that there are two ways of answering your question. One is in relation to what do people believe and what is likely to happen. What is likely to happen is very difficult to imagine. What is happening at the moment and how it is that vice chancellors, for example, imagining a post-COVID world is a world with a very close link between territoriality and mobility as had existed in 2018 and 2019. In other words, they want to return to that particular, whether they will be able to is another question.
Yeah, my sense is the role of the state has been changed by the pandemic, by the geopolitical tensions at the same time, and so on. But we'll see how that plays out. As you say, we don't know really, do we yet? Now we've got some questions coming through in the chat. I'd like to ask one on behalf of Doria Abdullah from Malaysia, who's asked me to do so. She's directed her question to Annette, and her question is there a way to quantify the knowledge and experience brought back by international students as they return from their studies abroad? It would be interesting to see which side of the North-South divide benefit from international student mobility beyond dollars and cents.
That's a really great question. I'm not aware of any sort of quantitative models. And anytime, obviously you try to quantify something like knowledge, you get into what are your indicators, and that can be really tricky. So I can't necessarily give any sort of advice on a practical quantitative tool that currently exists. But I would say that most of what has been very clearly shown in research is what she said at the end, which was essentially where students have been going and sort of the flows of knowledge centers. However, as we speak, as Fazal and Simon have just spoken about changes, a lot of that has been changing as well in terms of different regional hubs and global shifts in power. So those things, are shifting as well. At this point, I'm not aware of any sort of quantitative tools for measuring that.
Thanks, Annette. I'd like to invite in Eric Dietrich at this point from NYU. Eric, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Fire away, Eric. Your question is, I think, in the chat already, but you can give it to us on camera.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry I can't turn my video on at the moment. I was wondering to what extent any of the authors, their research has found an intentional collaboration between governments and higher education sectors, as governments are stimulating or encouraging student mobility through scholarships, through visa regulations, things like that, that can encourage student mobility further. Or are the states and governments kind of acting largely independently of the higher education sector in some of these countries?
Can I answer?
You go ahead, Fazal.
Simon Bricker. There are a large number of states that are attempting to develop what they call diaspora strategies, and they're collaborating with the universities and higher education sector to find out what it is that the institutions need in order to actually allow them to better utilize the skills, the knowledges, the links, and all those other things that. So, for example, the Singapore government has developed a diaspora strategies. German government has developed a diaspora strategy. Australia has attempted to develop a diaspora strategy in relation to, and higher education comes part of that broader strategy. So, in other words, the states are deeply interested in the same way as they're interested in promoting commercial international education. They're interested in the export market, if you like, and how that can be facilitated through the use of the diasporas that exist within their communities and within the universities. And some of them are the kind of people that I was talking to, the alumni who have now become highly successful business people. They are being brought onto the committees, they're brought onto the working groups, et cetera, in order to actually advise governments as to what the governments could in fact do. I have actually done a report for the Australian Council for Learned Academies on this particular topic. And if you type in, well, if you write to me, I can give you reference to that particular report.
Thanks, Fazal, and thanks, Eric. Leslie Bash, please. Leslie, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, yes. I suppose I'm rolling the discussion back a bit to revisit the notion of diaspora. And I think probably Annette, to some extent, has answered this or responded to this by saying how the notion of diaspora changes. But it still seems to me that it's still a fairly slippery notion, because the question I'm asking is, to what extent is it a socio-historical construct? And diasporization involves, in my view, greater or lesser extent, degrees of homogeneity and heterogeneity. I think of what Terri said, you know, in her comparative study of Korean and Jewish diasporas. I'm wondering whether we're talking about the same thing here. And I suppose I take it the extreme, go to the extreme by talking about the Jews in Nazi Germany, who didn't perceive themselves in any way to be a diasporic group, but as simply another group of Germans, until, of course, they were told otherwise.
I think, may I respond to Leslie first?
Yeah.
I think that the so-called the Jewish question, which I compared with the Joseon question, referring to Korea, are not exactly the same, but there are commonalities, because as Leslie raised that the question of the German Jews, they consider themselves as German, but then within their own country, Germany, the Jewish question dealt with this civil, legal, national, and political status of Jews, and then they didn't have the equal rights. And then same for the Koreans in their own home country. So again, this the boundaries of the exclusion of the ethno-national diaspora is, I think, it can be flexible depending on who is defining the diaspora. So the plurality of the term diaspora is, and its different organizing principles, it should be understood in this specific context of the geopolitics of the time in the early 20th century, and then also after the foundation of the Jewish nation state. So our paper dealt with this, the plurality of the diaspora, and then the boundaries as a footnote.
Can I come back on that?
Yes, please, quickly.
Yeah, just very briefly. Now, I understand what you're saying, Terri, but of course, if you chart the history of the Jews in Germany over centuries, there have been changes, you know, where, you know, at one time they were very much, if you like, a diasporic group within Germany, and then that changed from the sort of as other historical changes took place during the course of the 19th century, so that you got to a point where German Jews considered themselves German first, and just by the way, they're also Jewish, but that was merely a sort of incidental, because their you know, their cultural identifiers were in the main German, are not Jewish. And only as the sort of the Nazi regime progressively introduced anti-Jewish laws, and then of course we know what happened after that. Then of course you had a kind of a diasporic identity thrust upon German Jews.
Yes.
Terri, yeah, rather than having a further exchange, I think I'd like to bring a couple more people in. We've got very little time left. So we've got about 5 minutes. We usually run to about 5 past and then lose too many people, so we stop then. I'm going to invite 2 people to ask questions and then give the panel the chance to briefly respond. I hope we've got time for everyone. We may not, but we'll see how we go. First, Victorita, please. Victorita Triff, would you like to ask your question?
Hello. Thank you, Simon. Congratulations for all the authors from today. How to nurture the graduates from diaspora in order to perform? Thank you.
Okay, so keep that one in mind, folks, before you respond. Tugay Durek, could you ask your question, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Actually, I was asking that what factors do affect the belonging and identity of the diaspora members? I mean that, for example, sometimes if the diaspora members coming from a country which there are different ethnicities, and then at some point they may feel belong to different categories originated from the same country. That was the question. What factors shape this kind of identity formation?
Well, colleagues on the panel, the webinar is finishing all too soon. We're just beginning to open up some issues, but let me give you the chance to respond to both questions and perhaps say anything else you want to say as your concluding statement. Let's take it in reverse order. So we finish with Paul and we start with Fazal.
Oh, thank you, Simon. Well, it's an interesting question, actually, because diaspora is simply a category that is constructed for particular purposes in particular locations in a particular slice of history, not all of history, so slice of history. So for example, it is possible to actually say that there is a Tamil diaspora, despite the fact that Tamil is not a nation, you know, and then those very same people who are part of Tamil diaspora are also Indian diaspora. So in other words, you can have the same person identifying with a multiple categories of diaspora, multiple ways of thinking about diaspora rather than, so for example, it is possible for people to refer to themselves as business diaspora or academic diaspora. So in that sense, the term diaspora has become really quite broad. And I think you're right, it has become slippery, but at the same time, people have begun to identify themselves as being somebody who actually has either multiple citizenships or multiple senses of belonging. And for them, the notion of diaspora is superior to the notion of migration or indeed ethnicity. So I think what we are seeing at the moment is a period in which diaspora is being asked to do perhaps more work than it has done in the past. And as a result, it is confusing, largely because its uses are multiple and are emerging from a wide variety of different perspectives. As far as the question about graduates and how they are nurtured, I think what we are seeing in business schools in particular is certain kind of nurturing already going on that quite often lacks criticality, that often doesn't highlight how it is that a particular kind of subjectivity is produced through its curriculum and through its pedagogy. Now, whether you would like a different kind of subjectivity through business schools and through universities generally, and different kind of experience to be nurtured is, of course, an open question that needs to be debated in terms of the objectives of higher education and goals of higher education.
So often we find ourselves exploring concepts and working out what we can do with them, thinking about them differently, and finding that opens up as another slice of reality for us. Terri, would you like to say something at the end?
Thank you, Simon. I think that Fazal already covered eloquently what I wanted to say as well. But this diaspora theorization in relation to the internationalization in higher education has not been done before thoroughly. And I think our special issue began to theorize this connection, and then it's without this kind of static definition, operational definition of the diaspora, we have explored this the multiple meanings and the roles of diaspora in relation to higher education in the special issue. So I hope that the audience in this webinar will definitely read our special issue and then follow up the residual questions and issues further. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Terri. Everyone should look out for that special issue. And Annette, I think you've got the next word.
Yeah, I agree with Terri. I think that Fazal answered the questions very well that were asked by our last by our last two colleagues. I wanted to also just obviously reinforce what Terri said, that really for us, the last 2 years of working together throughout these forums was really an experience to try to come together and to rethink a lot of these ideas and how they've been changing over time. So that's what we've been trying to do in the special issue. And I think there's really a lot of potential and a lot of work that is yet to be done that can be taken in different ways. I also just wanted to say, along with that idea of taking things in different ways, just briefly, the example that Leslie gave about people perceiving themselves as something versus a state perceiving themselves as part of a diaspora. That's something that obviously in the example that Leslie, you gave, it's a very stark example, but I think that it's something that we see and we can think of all the time. That's something that's ongoing, and that's part of sort of one of this process approach of thinking about the politics behind assigning identities and who has the power to assign those identities and how do we speak about them and sort of those homogenizing processes. So I think that's really important for us to keep in mind. And on that, I think I'll pass over to Paul for last.
Thanks, Annette. Paul.
Simon, Annette, thank you very much. I'd just very briefly pick up on 2 points that were raised in the discussion. One, the question of how to nurture graduates from diaspora in order to perform. I think the key question there is perform for who? And I think Fazal has partly answered that a large number, of course, going through business studies degrees is a very clear ideology that they're inducted into. So a really interesting question would be, sort of, what about other types of programs, such as social science or education? How do members of diaspora sort of operate and come out of those, where their connections to business and entrepreneurship are not quite so clear? And certainly in education, we do see many students who are challenged by exactly what their identity is. Secondly, the point about states that was raised earlier by, sorry, I can't remember the gentleman's name, are states actively involved in this? I think 2 of the papers do address this very directly. One looking at diasporic activities within China and the role of the state. And secondly, that's by Christine Han and Yavin Tong, and the paper by Brooks and Waters, which looks at 4 broadly authoritarian states to analyse their approach to their diasporas. Both of them point to sort of very active states. I'll finish there, Simon, and thank you very much.
Yeah, look, thanks, Paul. And I think that the webinar's achieved its objective of getting us to think more about the issues, but also making us aware of the special issue, which is a pretty solid important piece of work. Colleagues, I must apologise to those we couldn't bring into the discussion today. We ran out of time. Morshidal particularly, I think, was waiting for a little while. Hopefully you'll come back next time and join our discussion then. Always good to put your thoughts into the chat as early as you can in these webinars to make sure you get on the list. Same with India, Rishaba Deo. Apologies to you too. Hopefully you'll come back and join us next time. Colleagues, as Trevor's been telling you in the chat, we have 3 webinars this week. The webinar tomorrow, Wednesday, is called Access Can Be Affordable, Ensuring a Sustainable Tuition Loan System in England. The UK is going through one of those periods in student tuition and student support arrangements where the agenda is really open, where it could go either way or could go a number of ways. Treasury is bearing down on the budget, saying the cost of the loan system is unsustainable. It's relatively generous in some respects. And the question that's arising is, will the loan system be tweaked, and this is an electoral risk for the government, by making people pay back earlier or pay back at higher rates of interest, or perhaps pay over a lifetime, not over 20 years? or instead will the tuition level be cut, which would be a popular move, but would do quite a lot of harm to the universities and colleges. So we're waiting to see on that, but we've got a period of 2 or 3 months when those decisions are going to be made, and Nick Hillman from the Higher Education Policy Institute will present his solution to that problem tomorrow, and Lorraine Dearden from Institute of Education at UCL, an economist of education of great renown, will give her view on Nick's plan. So we hope to see you tomorrow. It's an important discussion in the UK, but it will have broader global resonances as well, I'm sure. Thanks very much. Thanks again to the panel, and bye for now.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Simon.
Bye-bye.